The sound of a hammer, rhythmic and persistent, broke the morning stillness. Each strike connected with a piece of weathered wood, sending small puffs of rust-colored dust into the air. The source of this labor was an elderly man, Dawood, his movements slow but deliberate. He worked on a fence, a long, neglected structure that bordered a field overgrown with weeds and wildflowers. It was a boundary that seemed to serve no purpose, a relic of a time long past. Dawood arrived at the fence every day, his tools carried in a worn canvas bag. He moved with a quiet focus, his attention fixed on the task at hand. He examined each section of the fence, his fingers tracing the cracks and splinters in the decaying wood. He selected replacement planks with care, choosing pieces that, to others, might have seemed just as useless as the ones he removed. Children, on their way to school, would often pause to watch him. They would point and giggle, their voices carrying on the morning breeze. Teenagers, more interested in their phones, would sometimes record him, their expressions a mix of confusion and mild amusement. They couldn't understand why he would spend his time on something so old and broken. The adults in the village had grown accustomed to the sight of Dawood at the fence. They would pass by, shaking their heads with a mixture of pity and bewilderment. "He's been at it again," they would say to each other, their voices filled with a gentle, almost resigned tone. "What does he think he's doing? It's beyond repair." But Dawood remained undeterred. He continued his work, oblivious to the stares and comments. He replaced rotten boards, straightened bent nails, and tightened loose wires that sagged like forgotten memories. There was a quiet intensity in his actions, a sense of purpose that transcended the apparent futility of his efforts. He would sometimes pause, his hand resting on a sturdy post, his gaze sweeping across the overgrown field, a hint of something deep and personal in his eyes. What was the secret that bound this old man to this forgotten fence? What story did it hold that only he seemed to know? Dawood's hands, calloused and strong, moved with a practiced ease. He selected each piece of wood with a discerning eye, rejecting those that were too far gone, carefully measuring and cutting the replacements. The rhythmic sound of the hammer became a familiar part of the morning, a steady pulse in the quiet village. He worked slowly, methodically, as if engaged in a task of great importance. The fence, a patchwork of old and new wood, began to show signs of his patient labor. He often paused, his gaze drifting beyond the fence, towards the overgrown field. A faint smile might touch his lips, or a shadow of sadness would pass across his face. These moments hinted at a connection, a memory tied to this place that remained unspoken. He would sometimes pull out a small, worn object from his pocket, a faded photograph, perhaps, or a smooth, river-worn stone, holding it briefly before returning to his work. One young woman, Zara, watched Dawood with a different kind of curiosity. Unlike the others, she felt a sense of respect for his dedication. She noticed the care he took with each piece of wood, the way he seemed to be preserving something, not just fixing a broken structure. She began to visit the fence more often, observing his movements from a respectful distance. Zara tried to engage Dawood in conversation. "It's getting stronger," she said one morning, gesturing to a newly repaired section. Dawood nodded, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Needs to be," he replied, his voice raspy but firm. He offered no further explanation, leaving Zara with more questions than answers. "Another day," Zara asked. "Why this fence?" Dawood paused, his hand resting on a weathered post. He looked towards the field, his gaze distant. "This place remembers," he said softly, his words barely audible. He turned back to his work, leaving Zara to ponder the meaning of his cryptic reply. The villagers, though still largely indifferent, began to notice the slow but steady progress. The fence, once a symbol of neglect, was gradually becoming a testament to one man's unwavering commitment. A sense of anticipation, A feeling that something significant was about to unfold started to stir beneath the surface of their daily lives. The distant rumble grew louder, a sound that didn't belong in the quiet rhythm of the village. It wasn't the usual farm equipment or the occasional passing truck. A line of military vehicles appeared on the road, their heavy forms moving with a purpose that drew the attention of everyone nearby. The convoy stopped near the overgrown field, a cluster of uniformed figures emerging from the vehicles. Villagers came out of their homes, their daily routines interrupted by this unexpected arrival. They gathered at a safe distance, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The sight of soldiers, their presence so different from the familiar faces of their neighbors, created a sense of unease and anticipation. One officer, his uniform crisp and his bearing authoritative, stepped forward. He didn't join the gathering villagers. Instead, he walked towards the fence, his gaze fixed on the repaired sections. He moved slowly, his hand lightly touching the old wood as he examined the craftsmanship. There was a thoughtfulness in his expression, a sense of recognition. He paused at a particular spot, his eyes lingering on a section that was noticeably different from the rest. He seemed to be searching for something, his gaze sweeping across the field beyond the fence. A soldier approached him, offering a worn map. The officer unfolded it carefully, comparing the lines on the faded paper to the landscape before him. A village elder, drawn by the unusual activity, approached cautiously. The officer turned to him, his voice low and respectful. "This field," he began, his question precise. "Was there something here, many years ago?" The elder's brow furrowed, his eyes clouding with the effort of remembering. He spoke slowly, his words hesitant at first, then gaining a fragile certainty. "A gathering," he said. "A place of farewells." The officer's expression shifted. A flicker of understanding crossed his face, a realization that went beyond the lines on the map. He looked at the fence again, his gaze now filled with a different kind of respect. The mystery of the old man's work, the purpose behind his tireless dedication, seemed to hang in the air, waiting to be revealed. The officer spoke, his voice carrying a weight of history. "This fence," he explained, "this field. It was a departure point. Men left from here, long ago, to fight in a war far from home." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the gathered villagers, their initial curiosity now replaced by a hushed attentiveness. "Families gathered here," he continued, "said their goodbyes. It was a place of hope and sorrow, a place of last farewells." He turned to Dawood, who stood silently near the fence, his weathered face showing no emotion. The officer's voice softened. "He remembers," he said, indicating Dawood. "He keeps the memory alive." A young woman in the crowd gasped softly, her hand flying to her mouth. She remembered her grandfather, a faded photograph he kept, a story of leaving from a place like this. Others in the village began to recall fragments of stories passed down through generations, whispers of a time when the field was filled with soldiers and the air was thick with emotion. Dawood, his silence finally broken, spoke in a low, steady voice. "They left," he said, his gaze fixed on a particular section of the fence, "and some never returned." He touched the wood, his fingers tracing the grain. "This fence, it is all that is left. A reminder." The villagers looked at the fence with new eyes. The broken-down structure, once a symbol of neglect, now stood as a silent monument, a tangible link to a past they had almost forgotten. The young people who had mocked Dawood now stood in respectful silence, a dawning understanding on their faces. The officer presented Dawood with a small, folded flag. "For your service," he said, his voice filled with a deep respect, "for keeping their memory alive." The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the field. The villagers slowly dispersed, leaving Dawood alone with the fence. But it was no longer the solitude of a misunderstood old man. It was the quiet dignity of a guardian, a keeper of memory. The fence, now understood, stood tall and proud, a testament to the enduring power of remembrance.